When we think about how men settled disputes back in American history, one image probably pops into your head, right? Two guys, pistols drawn at dawn. But that's only half the story. And the other half, well, it's a lot more common, way more chaotic, and just infinitely more brutal. All right, let's get into it.
So let's start with that picture-perfect image we all have in our minds, the gentleman's duel. This was seen as the way to handle an affair of honor. And, there's no example more famous in all of American history. I mean, the setting itself is almost as legendary as the guys involved. Picture it, a quiet, secluded ledge right across the Hudson from New York City. This is where two of the most powerful men in the entire country met to settle things, with pistols. And this was no back alley brawl, not at all. It was this highly structured, almost theatrical event. I mean, just look at how formal this whole process was. They called it the Code Duello, and it was this whole set of super elaborate rules, basically borrowed from European nobles. See, the goal wasn't just raw violence. It was about proving your honor by showing restraint and courage, all inside this really strict, almost choreographed dance. And right at the center of it all, you've got these two guys who were like a total study in contrasts. You have Alexander Hamilton, the scrappy, tenacious orphan who literally clawed his way to the top. And then you have Aaron Burr, the guy born into the very world that Hamilton was so desperately fighting to get into. That huge difference in their backgrounds and just who they were, it fueled this incredibly bitter rivalry that, well, was going to end in tragedy.
So how did it even get to this point? Well, this was a political battle that had been brewing for years. Hamilton just did not trust Burr, not one bit, and he worked nonstop to keep him out of power. The final straw came in 1804. Hamilton helped sink Burr's bid to become governor of New York, and Burr was just done. He demanded an apology for all the insults. Hamilton refused, and that was it. The path to Weehawken was set in stone. And the result? Well, it's history. Hamilton gets shot, and he dies the very next day. And this is where you see the really strange legal situation at the time. Burr was actually charged with murder. But, and this is the key part, since dueling was this sort of accepted, even though it was illegal, thing for gentlemen to do, no jury was ever going to convict one of their own. It basically operated in this gray area, completely outside the normal legal system. Okay, but here's the thing. This whole story of pistols and protocols and fancy codes on a quiet riverbank, that's only a tiny, tiny sliver of the picture of how honor was defended in 19th century America. For most guys, a fight for honor, well, it sounded very, very different. So let's just ask the question straight up. Was the duel really how most American men fought for their honor? And the answer is a huge, resounding no, not even close. For the vast majority of working-class guys, from the slums of New York all the way to the backwoods of the South, settling an affair of honor was a much, much messier business. And that is the sound of that other world. There are no negotiations here. No seconds. No rowing to a special secluded spot. This is just a direct challenge, an immediate acceptance, and the promise of violence right then and there. It's raw. It's aggressive. And it is a whole world away from Hamilton and Burr. Now, you might recognize that moment from the movie Gangs of New York, and it just perfectly captures the vibe. These were not gentlemen arguing about politics. These were working-class Irish immigrants in a place called the Five Points, and the way they fought came from a totally different tradition. And that tradition, it actually had a name. It was called the Rough and Tumble. And believe me, it had nothing to do with restraint or the kind of honor the elites were talking about. This was all about pure, unfiltered, and frankly, shocking brutality. So let's be really clear about what we're talking about here. The rough and tumble was kind of like the democratic form of combat. You didn't need fancy, expensive pistols, you didn't need powerful friends. All you needed was a problem with someone and a total lack of concern for anything we would call fair play. And right here, this is the most important difference. In a duel, the goal was to get your honor back, and a lot of times you didn't even want to kill the other guy. But in a rough and tumble fight, the goal was to permanently disfigure them, to leave a visible, lasting mark of humiliation on your opponent for everyone to see. And the methods they used were, well, they were horrifying, because literally
anything was allowed. I mean, eye gouging was so common that the fighting style was often just called gouging. You had men who would grow their fingernails long and sharpen them into talons. They'd bite off noses, ears. They would fishhook a guy's cheek, literally ripping it open. And get this, these weren't seen as dirty tricks. They were standard moves.
Okay, so why? Why this massive difference? Why did one group use pistols and follow a bunch of rules, while the other used teeth and nails and had no rules at all? Well, the answer, like it so often is in history, really just comes down to social class.
It really just boils down to this. The duel, that was an import. It was something America's upper class adopted because they wanted to be like the nobles in Europe. But the rough and tumble, that had deeper, grittier, homegrown American roots. So you had these two traditions of honor running side by side, but they were completely shaped by which class you belonged to.
And if we break it down even more, you can really see how class controlled every single part of it. The weapons, where the fight happened, everything. But the most important part is that last row on the table. In their own circles, both of these incredibly violent traditions were seen as perfectly acceptable ways for a man to defend his honor.
So where did this rough and tumble stuff even come from? Well, historians have traced it back to the Scotch-Irish immigrants who settled the American South and the backcountry. See, they came from a place where the government was pretty weak, and a man's reputation, his willingness to be violent, was basically the only thing protecting his family and his stuff. And they brought that raw, brutal idea of honor right along with them. So, for about a century, these two very different, very violent traditions were a huge part of American life. But over time, they both started to fade away. Well, mostly. So what happened? What changed? It really came down to two major shifts in society. First, the government and the justice system got a lot more powerful and organized. They basically took over the job of settling disputes. You didn't have to gouge a guy's eye out anymore. You could just sue him. And second, our ideas about masculinity started to evolve. That kind of extreme public violence wasn't seen as honorable anymore. It was seen as savage. But it never actually vanished completely. Even today, in certain isolated communities, like with the Irish traveler culture, for example, you'll still see men settling disputes with these brutal, bare-knuckle fights, where, yeah, maiming is still the goal. It's this incredible, kind of shocking echo of this violent past, and it just goes to show you how hard it can be to erase these old codes of honor. And all of this really leaves us with one final thought, doesn't it? We've obviously moved on from duels and gouging matches, but the idea of defending your honor, that hasn't gone away. So it really makes you wonder, if raw physical violence was the ultimate way to settle things back then, what is it that settles our honor now?